Howdy, folks. Today we're diving into the art of the portrait, exploring how lighting, posing, and the business of portraiture come together to create timeless images. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. And hey, if you haven't already, make sure you sign up to the Camera Shake mailing list over at www.camerashakepodcast.com. We've got some awesome stuff coming up soon, so make sure you get your name down on that list ASAP. Now, without further ado, though, let's give it up for today's special guest, master portrait photographer, educator, and creative powerhouse that is Mr. Gary Hill. Gary, man, how's it going?
I am all good. How are you? Thank you for inviting me along.
Hey, it's been a long time coming. I think we've talked about you coming on the show since, I guess since I met you at Imaging USA in Dallas or something.
Yeah, I would say so. It was January or February this year. I can't remember when it was. It's been a busy year.
Yeah, you've been really busy. I've met you at a variety of expos and stuff in the past. What have you been up to over the last year?
The last year I was still working full-time with Charlie at Click. So we were half a dozen expos in the US, along with 14 UK ones, I think we did. But I'm still working a little bit with Charlie. I'm still his director of photography, but I'm now working with the Guild of Photographers as the head of education and events. So lots of new stuff we're planning in the pipeline there. And it's just been busy. You know, so it's never straightforward. So there's something to do. And when you've got a creative brain and people say, okay, come up with ideas, then you throw a load of things and some stick, don't they?
Yeah. And I mean, your ideas, when I look at your images, are absolutely phenomenal. Now, for those who maybe don't know you yet, how did you first get started in portrait photography, particularly?
Well, that's an interesting one. Very different to probably most people. Like most people, it was a hobby. When I was younger, I was quite into climbing and walking in the Lake District in the north of England. So I would take a camera along take some record shots of the walk and things like that. And then as I got older, I decided to buy a DSLR. Just decided I was going to have one and learn how to take photographs. So I bought a Canon 30D, it was. Jumped in at the deep end. I'd only worked on film before that. And then I started taking pictures of people, and then other people asked me to take pictures of them. And it just kind of went from there. And then because of the job I was doing at the time, I was given an opportunity to use a space. So I had a space. I bought some studio lights. I spent days and days in there just taking pictures of anything and everything and learning how the light fell and where it fell and cause and effect and those kind of things, and took it from there. And then I eventually decided to leave my old job and went into the portrait photography business. And that was 15 years ago now.
They're coming from the north of England, where there's beautiful countryside, and I always associate it with beautiful landscape imagery, wildlife imagery, because that's what I always hear from people in on the camera club scene, for example, when they talk about Yorkshire and Lancashire and places like that. What specifically drew you to portrait photography?
I'm a people person. I like people. I do enjoy the landscape. I don't live in the north anymore, and I miss it dearly. I was there last week. But I'm a people person first and foremost, and I think that's my skill as a portrait photographer is more as a people person than as a photographer, if I'm honest. So it was I'd always dealt with people. I was in the police service for 17 years, so I was used to dealing with people in general, and I think that's a skill that, when I'm educating and when I'm teaching, I can spend 10 minutes with a photographer and I'll tell you whether they'll make it as a portrait photographer. And it's nothing to do with technical skills, because they can be learned. It's the people skills. So I think that's why I went into people, and that's why I've stuck with people ever since. I'll still take a landscape, but it's got to have a person in it.
It's an interesting thing, because I always say this, broadly speaking, I've mentioned this many times on this podcast, you can take photographers and put them into two categories, those who shoot people and those who don't. And it really always boils down to whether somebody is a people person or not.
100%. I think it's a hard skill to teach people. I think it's just a natural thing, whether people have it or they don't. You know,
Possible, yeah.
and
Sorry, go for it.
and if not, there's plenty of other genres in photography that you can go and deal without people, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, have you ever tried product photography?
No, no. Well, I have actually. I've had to do it. I once I did a whole catalogue for a security company that was everything from a nut and bolt up to a shutter, and it was just like the most soul-destroying aspect of my life. Technically, it was brilliant because I learned so much about dealing with the reflections and things like that. But would I repeat that 4 weeks of work? Never, no matter how much money it made.
There's an interesting thing, I had Kyle Taylor on the show
Oh yeah,
some time ago, and I really admire his product work. I have to say, it's beautiful, it's stunning, it's so clever
yeah,
as well. And the thing I love about that is the problem solving aspect. It's trying to figure out how to do something different, and there's so many technical aspects, and I think it kind of speaks to my kind of technical brain a little bit. But I did have to, and again, I apologize for those of you listening or watching. I've mentioned this many times before, but during the pandemic, I was forced to do some product photography because, lockdowns and things. And it was, as you say, it was soul destroying. It was unbelievable. Oh my God.
I definitely think there's a definite persona around product photography. There's some really good, and Carl's an excellent example of a superb product photographer, a good photographer all around as well, but his product work in particular is tremendous. But I think you have to have that problem solving, which I like. I like problem solving, but I like problem solving with the person.
Yeah.
I like that interaction that comes from a good portrait shoot.
Yeah.
That's what it is for me.
Does your northern, what's the word? Your northern personality, does it help you being more of a people person, do you think?
I think so. Having moved down to, I call it the South Midlands, but Emma, my partner, says we firmly live in the South, in Bedfordshire now. There's a difference in personalities between the North and the South. There very much is. And I think it's a different pace of life that leads to that. And I can't even say it's a city thing because I spent a lot of time growing up in Manchester, which is a very busy city. But I think people have more time for you in the North. And I get it, having commuted to Watford for 2.5 years down the M1 and having to, spend anything from what should be a 50-minute journey up to 3 hours on the M1 each way, then I understand why they don't have time to be friendly down south. But
Yeah.
I think there is a difference in the North and South, and I don't mean that in any disrespect to any of the Southerners, but I think because we have that slightly slower pace of life, because we're not commuting everywhere, that actually we have more time for people. And I think growing up, it's something that indents on you.
There's also that interest in people, I think, that's important. I know this. Like, I grew up in the south of Germany, and in Germany, basically, it's the other way around. The north is really hectic and busy. You get cities like Hamburg and places like that, Cologne or whatever, big cities. The south is a little bit different. It's more rural. It's more, I grew up in a place called Stuttgart, which is also known as the biggest village in the country. It's a city, but it's a vine region. It's a village mentality. Everything's slow. Everything's a little backwards. It's like the West Country, I think. You could probably.
It's very pretty though. I've been to Stuttgart on my way to the Graffi Castle. I drove across there and we called in at Stuttgart for a couple of hours, 6 a.m. photographing on the streets, and it's actually really cool. Took a model around the streets, and it was a pretty cool city.
Yeah, it's
but
nice.
but it's like you say, it's quite. Although it's a city, it's a rural city.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's the same thing. I like the slower pace of life, and also the fact that people take more time, but also more interest in other people. This is the thing I find. One thing I found when I moved to London, to start with, this is like 30 years ago, really now, but it was this thing. Like, I lived in a place, and I shared a house, and I spoke to my flatmate who owned the house, and I'm like, hey, do you know, like, who are your neighbors? And he goes, I don't know, no idea. And like, how long have you lived here? Well, 20 years. Like, you've lived here 20 years and you don't know who your neighbors are.
yeah.
Unbelievable.
I spent the whole of lockdown talking to my two neighbours back at my house up north, either side of the garden wall as such, and we chatted every day. And we would all make a drink and come sit out in the garden and chat with each other, and because that's all we could do back then.
Yeah.
But yeah, whereas the neighbours down here are pretty good where I am, but I can understand why in London people don't know the neighbours. It's a shame. It's a shame because community builds connections.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, your work is very much defined by by your lighting style and the play between highlights and shadows. Um, how would you describe your overall lighting style or philosophy?
Clean and simple. Literally clean and simple. If I can do it with one light, I'll do it with one light. And, I spent a lot of time when I was starting out in photography using one light. When I had my first studio, I used one light for the first 2 years. Literally one flash unit, 2 meter softbox, and literally I learned to do everything with that. And it's amazing actually what that teaches you.
Yeah.
Control in a small space, control in a big space. It teaches you about how many different things you can get out of one modifier. The art of hanging black paper all over your modifier to change the shape of the light and things like that is, I think, because I came into the industry as a split decision, I didn't have masses of money to invest in all the studio kit and everything else that I really wanted. So I had to make do with what I did. And I think that teaches you to be a more refined photographer, if I'm honest.
It's always my number one tip is, just to get one cheapish speed light, and one modifier, and then just play with that for a long time. It's very similar to I first started in Portraiture. I was a breadless musician at the time. I didn't have any money to buy like fancy studio gear, In the beginning, I had one speed light and a pop-up square softbox. Oh, these pop-up things. So what was that, like 60 centimeters across?
60 centimeters,
yeah. And that was it. That's all I had. I had one light stand, which is very wobbly, didn't work very well. But, that was it. It's, and I shot with that for a good couple of years. And in fact, I started my headshot business at the time eventually I had 3 speed lights, basically, but it all battery-powered speed lights, no studios. It took a long time until I could afford studio strobes.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do. Because I used to shoot the odd wedding. Well, I used to shoot quite a lot of weddings, but now I do the very odd wedding. And I kept breaking Canon speed lights because I put them on 15-foot light stands to light somebody on a bridge and things like that. So I stopped buying expensive speed lights and bought £30 young Nero ones. And at one time I literally had a bag with like 7 or 8 of them and wireless triggers. And it was unbelievable. I shot magazine adverts and all sorts with those speed lights. And it's just the knowledge of how to use them is more important than the light that you've got, is what I would say on that. And you only get that knowledge either through learning from somebody else or by practice.
What's the real advantage of sort of, graduating might not be the right word, but by sort of, investing into a studio strobe over a speed light, in your opinion?
Number one is power. You'll always get more power out of a studio head. 2 is the shape of the light. It's different nowadays with things like the AD200 and something, which have a bare bulb effect and all of that. But so a lot of the issues I used to have with speedlight is it was rectangular, and even when you put the wide angle diffuser on, it doesn't get to the corners of a big softbox and those kind of things. Whereas a studio light where the flash tube is actually present forward of the shaper so that there's nothing to block it on all directions, gives you a much more even spread of light that you can then control. So that, and the convenience as well of not having to recharge batteries and things like that is a big thing. Saying that, I went on the road for the Society's Roadshows this year and only took battery lights because I knew I wasn't taking any number of shots, and I was still if I was to do a headshot job in say London or something like that, I would pack everything in one roller case and one lighting stand bag, and away I'd go. I wouldn't be taking the big studio heads. I'd be taking my quadras and things like that.
Yeah. I just recently got hold of a little a pro photo. It's sort of a mini studio strobe type of a thing. I don't remember what the actual model number is, but it is actually really it's interesting because the battery lasts absolutely forever. You know, I did a number of sessions with that without even charging the battery in between, and it was like, oof, this is like that's different.
Yeah, especially now with the ISO capabilities of cameras, you're not worrying. I remember many years ago, I went through a short phase of having a Hasselblad HD39, and it was an amazing camera as long as you shot at 100 ISO.
Yeah.
If you shot anything other than 100 ISO, it was just diabolical. And I was like, whoa. So but nowadays, if you're shooting an interior job or a headshot inside, I'd happily shoot 1600, 3200 ISO with a speed light because I don't need the power anymore. And like you say, you get 800 shots out of a battery light at those kind of power.
That's actually one of the best tips I ever got when it comes to speed lights. Quite in the beginning, when I first started out, was that somebody told me, right, look, if you every time you double the power, every time you double the ISO on your camera, you actually have the power on your speed light. Therefore, your 4 AA batteries that you've got in your speed light will go a lot further if you shoot even at ISO 400, let's say, which actually makes very little difference with modern cameras anyhow.
Oh, absolutely. And even 10 years ago, it didn't make that much difference as long as your exposure's clean. But it's something I still use in the studio now. Say I'm doing a family shoot and I decide that I'm going to shoot grandma at f4, for example, because I just want that soft fall off of depth of field so that not all the wrinkles are super sharp or as I say to them, experience on their faces isn't super sharp. Then I'll set my lights up at f4, but then I've got to do a family group at f8. I won't change my light. I'll just double take my ISO up to 400 and just shoot it like that. It's just quicker.
Yeah.
And on the Fujifilm GFX 102 that I shoot, I'd challenge anybody to tell the difference on a 60x40 print.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that goes for things like the Nikon Z8 3.0. You can't really see a difference there.
No, not at all. Definitely not.
Yeah. So what is your go-to lighting setup nowadays? Like, let's say for if you were to create like a timeless portrait type of a thing, what would be your go-to lighting?
2 studio heads. So I use Elinchrom. I'm sponsored by Elinchrom UK and the Flash Centre in the UK. So I've been an Elinchrom user for 10 years now. So whatever Elinchrom I needed for the job power-wise, an ELC 500 or even a 100 if it's all that I need, I put a nice big octabox on, a 135 or a 150. I have 2 135s. I have one that we keep in the studio. I have one that's permanently packed away to go on location for me because it's just such a versatile box. And I would have a 90 by 30 centimeter strip box. And that way, with that, my Manfrotto Avenger stand, which has been all around the world. Charlie at Click hates it because it weighs an absolute ton. But I know I can put a head on that, boom it overhead, add a little sandbag, and it is rock solid. And it's just everything to me that is about having that ability to switch from an upright stand to a boom arm just by adapting the stand that packs away into one stand. That is my go-to. It weighs about 7 kilos and I have to carry it everywhere but it is just brilliant. And I've got a choice then. I can flick a butterfly up. I can flick a loop or a Rembrandt up. And then I'll accent on one side. Depending if I want that timeless classic look, it'll be accented on the same side. If I want something a bit more contemporary, then I might accent on the opposite side and create that sandwich light effect and just make it a bit more interesting. Just depends what I'm doing. But I can do those in seconds, and I always say I'm the opposite to a lot of people. I'll work my key light first. I'll get my shadows where I want them to be. Then I will, do I need that additional light to bring in? But I'd say for about 8 out of 10 situations, I can get away with one light for most things. Just make sure it's correctly positioned. And I'm absolutely anal about using a light meter and a grey card. I use it all the time, and it just gives me that consistency. When I think that's the thing that people say is I'm always clean in my setups. The exposure's always good. I'm not fiddling about, Classic example was at Click Live the other week where I had literally 2 minutes with the model on stage and I took one picture. I took one grey card shot, one picture, and that was it. That's all I had time for before she had to go.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to me how using a light meter is almost like gone out of fashion. And the same with the grey card. It's just I don't see many people using them on a consistent basis for some reason.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is they don't really understand the why. 2, they think getting it right enough on the back of the camera is good enough for most people. And 3, I think it creates a tendency to overshoot if you don't use it. I'm quite happy. I do my grey card, I'll meter my lights, and my first shot should be 99% there. I dealt for a long time in my own studio where I had time for shoots. I would only shoot a maximum of 3 a day. Then I went working with Charlie at Click, and we would shoot 8 to 10 a day. So you want it as right in and we would also instant view there as well.
Right.
So it would literally be a case from boudoir to baby. Any shoot that was in, it was shot in an hour, and then it was taken straight into the viewing room with no Photoshop, no nothing. And images were sold directly on what came out of the camera.
It's really interesting, this, actually, because Charlie did take me through his process at one point. And what I found really interesting was how little culling there is. Like for the images straight from the camera to the ones that he actually shows the client, if he takes out a couple, that's probably a lot. More often than not, they're all good to go, really.
Yeah, well, very much. It was a case of we want them as right as we can in camera and don't overshoot.
Yeah.
Occasionally you've got a toddler running around the studio, you're going to shoot a lot of shots and miss shots on that. But if you're dealing with a boudoir client, a makeover client, or even a family client where you've not got very young children, we tended to work on a 70 to 80% hit rate on that. And I've always been the kind of photographer that works as if I'm working with film, even though I never really worked with film.
Yeah.
Because people say digital's free, but actually it isn't free. It isn't free. There's the storage capabilities and how much more you have to store if you shoot more. But most important for me, and I know things like Aftershoot and Imagine have changed it a little bit, but they're not as 100% accurate as culling by eye. And having to go through 50 shots in a portrait shoot takes no time, whereas I know people that shot 400 or 500 shots in a portrait shoot. To cull those takes time, and time is money. When you're working as a professional, as you know, time is money. And if I'm spending time culling, then I'm either lowering my rate or I'm not doing other things that I could do at the same time.
And that's the difference between shooting 1 or 2 shoots a day and shooting 7 or 8 shoots a day.
Yeah, very much so. But like I say, even before I worked with Charlie doing it that way in instant viewings, I was always want to shoot the least amount, but get it as right as possible. Because the other thing I found quite early in my career when I was selling photographs is it makes it harder for the client to choose if you give them too much choice. If I take the same headshot and nothing's moved and I take 10 frames, the client will take 5 minutes to choose which one they like. If I only show 2, they'll choose straight away.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps.
Yeah. And that's where they've got to have the trust in you as a photographer that you're going to pick the best images.
Yeah, and the thing is, of course, variability. Is that the word? Variation? That's probably the word. In terms of, I think variation in terms of outfit, backgrounds, and lighting setups lead to more sales in the headshot world as such. If I can shoot for a client in for an hour, let's say, and I can go through 4 or 5 different setups or looks or whatever, then I'm going to definitely sell more images than I shoot 500 images with the same backdrop and the same outfit.
Variety definitely sells. I learned that very quickly. But variety doesn't mean you shoot 500 shots.
Not correct.
Variety means that you can, when I was, say, on a makeover shoot, for example, I always look for 5 5s. That's what I look for, 5 5s. So it would be either 5 different backdrops or 5 different outfit changes or a combination of those. And I would look to shoot perhaps 8 to 10 images on each of those changes and cull to 5 to show the client, and end up with a gallery of 25 to 30 images. Simple as that.
Yeah, that's much easier to choose than from the client's perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And it saves time in the viewing room, and that's not being lazy, that's being efficient.
Yeah. And that's the sales component that comes into it. We talk a little bit more in detail about how to make a portrait studio profitable, or how to make it successful in a bit. I just want to drill down a little bit more on your lighting techniques. How do you decide whether you're going to use hard light or soft light, for example? What's the decision making process in your head when it comes to—
Okay, normally that's quite straightforward. If I'm dealing with the people that were walking through the doors of my studio, it would 99% of the time be soft light. Just because in experience, it showed me that, most of my clients were female or feminine presenting, is the technically correct word nowadays, would be feminine presenting, and I wanted to sell pictures. They wanted to look good. Nobody ever came into my studio and said, make me look bad. So the golden rule for me was always make the face look amazing, because it doesn't matter whether it's a boudoir shoot or otherwise, any type of shoot. If the face doesn't look good in the image, the client isn't buying it. Simple as that. It's the same, it's not a sexist thing. It's a true thing that when I was doing what would be called the average family, so it'd be 2 parents and children, if mum looked good in the picture and nobody else was doing anything stupid, we had more chance of selling that picture than if everybody else looked perfect and she wasn't quite. Because it's just the law of averages say that they will make the decision based on how they look in the image, whereas that most other people are not that bothered. So soft light was always my go-to, because it is much more complimentary for the average person on the street. With model shoots, I'll use Fresnel spots and everything else, and hard light, I'll go really hard if I have to. Bare bulb is something I quite enjoy doing, but the average person who's in the studio coming in for a photo shoot, it's just not going to look as good on them as well-controlled, soft, but contrasty light. I like shadows. One thing I learned early on, and one thing I teach, is don't always get rid of the shadows. Shadows are important in an image. Shadows create shape and structure, and also shadows can slim. When you understand light, shadows make the biggest difference in how somebody looks in an image.
I find exactly the same thing, and I wonder whether your perception of the importance of shadow comes from you starting out with one light. originally.
Yeah, quite possibly, but also I kind of, when I was learning to start and first started teaching really, and I got invited to go to um, a retreat, I would say, 20 photographers, 4 trainers. I was one of the trainers teaching studio. 3 of the others were natural light trainers, and they were always very much look for the light. And I'm like, no, I don't look for the light. I look for the shadow. Because when I place my light, I want the shadow to be in the right place and the right density and the right contrast. Because when that's right, my light is right. It's as simple as that. It's the way physics works. And they're like, well, I kind of get that, but we have to go and find the light. And I'm like, well, that's why I use strobes, because I've got my light. So maybe it is that I've always concentrated on the shadows. And also my own personal appreciation of art is very much more towards the Dutch masters than it is to modern art and things like that. So the use of chiaroscuro and of shadow and form has always been there for me, and then also seeing, particularly because I shot a lot of boudoir quite early on in my career, and seeing the effects of how complementary to the subjects that a lot of shadow can be, it shaped the way I light. As simple as that. I have a saying that comes up in my head, and I say it to people all the time: flat light is fat light, because it just rounds everything out, and it's as simple as that.
That should be the title of this episode.
Yeah, flat light is white light.
I like it.
If I want to sum somebody down, I'm going to put them in shadow.
I tell you what, I must have some T-shirts printed with that slogan on it. I love it.
Flat light is fat light. Yeah, I remember a very well-known Australian stroke American trainer having a discussion with me about that, because they were very much flat light is extremely complimentary. I went, yes, if you want to make people look big and fat and round, yes, it is. And just try it on a mannequin, try it on a dummy head, just light it flat and look how it looks on camera, and then shoot it from the short side with shadow and just look at the difference. And, people will agree with me then that flat light is fat light.
Yeah, I think that's
says the man who's sat right in front of the patio doors here with the flattest light ever.
This is the thing I love about old Hollywood portraits, the George Orwell style kind of portraits. I love that play between highlights and shadows. And I know, like for me, very specifically, when I first started with, one speed light and a relatively small pop-up softbox, I had to deal with a lot of shadow, because there's no getting around it. And for me, the thing was always, okay, well, here I have, I didn't even have a reflector to start with. I had white poster board. That's what I used. I had a sheet of white poster board, and then it was all about experimentation. Okay, well, if I move this closer, I can fill in the shadows a little bit. And then it was always a matter of like, okay, how deep can I get the shadows without losing the detail, and and then figuring all that kind of stuff out? I found that really interesting at the time.
Oh, I still do. I still, my go-to is I'll do it with one light. If that doesn't work, I'll bring in a reflector. If that doesn't work, then I need to go to 2 lights, and that's my thought process. I'm building a scene, building a portrait, whatever it may be. It's always that way. But I do think having that grounding of actually not having everything available means you learn to use these things. I was one that was at Hobbycraft and buying sheets of A1 foam core and sellotaping together to make a triflexion unit, because I didn't have one at the time.
Still doing that.
Yeah, and two pieces of duct tape and 3 pieces of foam core, 2 lighting stands and 2 clamps. And honestly, I've got a very functional, less pretty, and it doesn't look great for clients. But when I would also, and that was the other thing I also did, and I still try to do, is I always shot for myself, even when I was busy in the studio. One afternoon or one day a month was always my time to shoot an experiment. So it didn't matter if I had a piece of foam core as a reflector rather than something nice, because it didn't matter what the client perception was. It was about me learning and understanding. And I think if you go through that process, you actually learn better than walking into a studio where everything's provided for you and you just learn what you're told as such.
I think the problem with that is, I think that's quite problematic. And I remember I was lucky in a sense, very early on had access to some really, really well-equipped studios. But I found it really confusing in the beginning, you know, because I had all of these diffusers and all those different modifiers and lights and all, but I really didn't know what to do with any of it because it was just way over my head at the time.
Yeah, and you just end up trying things or wasting your time instead of actually just learning the basics, And I've always taught the basics, always taught ingredients, not recipes. That's something I'm very passionate about. Don't just learn a lighting setup that works. Learn the ingredients of that lighting setup, and then you can make different lighting setups using those ingredients. That's always the way I've taught. But you need to learn everything with one light before you get out to. That's one of my biggest things I would tell anybody to do is, honestly, 2 years in the studio doing family shoots and boudoir model shoots, all with one light was what I did until I had exhausted what I could do with it, and then I started bringing more in.
Incidentally, that's when you teach somebody how to play the guitar. You always start with one string. That's it. Smoke on the wire and one string. Do that, you graduate to Seven Nation Army. That's usually how it goes.
It's funny that actually, because my boy's here this week and he's a guitar player, and that's pretty much how he started as well.
Yeah,
but
absolutely, yeah. Most people start like that, and it makes perfect sense because for the same reason. Because you work from the simple to the more complex. That's and that's kind of how it works in education, just across the board. Now, there are lots of companies, I've noticed this over the last few years, there are lots of companies popping up who do, constant lights, basically. Everything from rotor lights to fill in the blank space with the name of some other new company that's come up. Now, from what you've been saying, you shoot a lot with flash. Why is that? And where do you see the advantage of shooting strobes as opposed to constant light and vice versa?
Okay. Strobes is the convenience of the power. Very affordable can give you 500 watts of power, which means that on a worst case scenario, take that outside with a longer extension lead and I can overpower the sun. And yes, I can overpower some of the speed light zoomed and all of that, but not to give me the same modification of light that I can get on a studio strobe. No matter what the conditions are, I can take control of the light, and in the same way, it allows me to control it a little bit better than I find constant light, even through the same modifier, because I'm with constant light, I'm fighting the trade-off between the amount of light and the position to give me the softness or the shadow that I want. But saying that, I've got to be honest, when I started going to America 3 years ago, Stella Pro was the name on the block at the time, bringing out constant lights, and I started to see a lot of the American photographers using constants in demonstrations and things like that. And that's where I can see a massive advantage. I myself included it the last 2 years at Shutterfest. I've used Nanlite, and at NAB I use Nanlite for the same thing. But, and as a company, Nanlite, when they give you 1,000 watts of controllable constant light, it does all the things that a flash can do, but in 4 times the size of the unit with the ballast and everything else, Right. But from an educational point of view or from a demonstration point of view, where you want to let everybody else shoot, constant light is fantastic because you're not swapping triggers around and all of that. And the power is coming with constant light that, it's only a matter of a year away where we'll get F16 at ISO 100 in a 2-meter softbox from a constant light at an affordable price, if you know what I mean. But I'm a little bit old school in that I want to keep that technology going rather than what they call it WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. I know what I'm going to get through experience. I don't want it to be, I know what I'm going to get because I can see it. if that makes sense. So constant, constant as well is fantastic for hybrid shooting. You know, if people are wanting to do video clips at the same time as they are shooting photographs, then it gives you that luxury of being able, if you're working with a content team, that the scene is as well lit for them as it is for you as a studio photographer as such. So I can see both benefits. And like I say, the last couple of years, I've seen a big movement in America in particular towards constant light. A lot of the educators over there use constant light. When we get to decent amounts of constant light in a battery powered unit, you know, Elinchron brought out the 100, which is pretty good. But when I can get 1,000 watt equivalent in a battery unit that doesn't take half a bus to carry it, then I think maybe I'll consider it. But at the moment, I can do that in a little box of flash, if you know what I mean. So there's place for both.
Yeah, this I have an old strobe. It's a massive bare bulb, and every time it goes off, it gives off this pop.
Yeah,
you know, and I love hearing that. I'm so fickle. That's why I love using that thing. It's just so I can hear that pop.
Well, when I started out, I had some cheap flash units, some Interfit ones.
Oh, I know them very well. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then shortly afterwards, I went on eBay and I bought Bowen's quads.
Right.
And we're talking a generator pack that was literally, you know, 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters by 30 centimeters, weighed about 10 kilos. You plugged in this massive monolight with a cable about this thick. And when it went off, it went with a pop and you could smell the ozone from where the air had been oxidized around it. And it was like, you know, it went up to 6,400 watts of flash and it was just like ridiculous. But they just worked. They just worked. You know?
Yeah, the Idifits, I used to shoot Idifits. I had a few honey badgers. I don't think I had 3 honey badgers lying around. And I used them a lot. I used to like the form factor. And, you know, at the time, and of course it's different now with products that are out on the market, but, you know, 5-6 years ago, in, you know, my shooting space is quite small. It's quite a small space. And so I needed units that had a smaller form factor, and I loved the honey badgers because they were cuboid, much like an old Alien B, if you remember those, you know, like cuboid, and they weren't as elongated as a lot of other lights, and so it basically meant I could get them closer to the wall.
Yeah,
and create, even if it was just a few inches, but you know, 2 inches here, 2 inches there, and 2 inches somewhere else, all of a sudden adds up to 6 inches. You know,
yeah, it makes a big difference in a small space.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, people say like, "Oh well, but you can shoot into the." Yeah, I can, but I don't want to because this is what I want to do, right? And so for me, they worked. The minute they didn't carry on working anymore, it was actually more of a trigger issue. They really didn't update their Nikon triggers, and there was a problem at that point, you know. And then it was time to change at that point.
Mm. Yeah, technology moves on quick. You know, it's like a lot of the systems are very complicated, triggering things that you control the inside of everything from. The Elinchron ones, I always have a habit of dropping the really expensive ones. So now they just give me the bog standard one that works with everything. And I like that because, you know, I just control the flash. I'm never that far away that I actually am too lazy to walk up to my flash unit and turn the power up or down. Well, I can do it even from the simple trigger, but it's just, I know it works and it's as simple as that. I used to like the Yongnuo 602 trigger for the speed lights because it worked with every camera on the market and you can't get them now. You know, they're obsolete now. And I'm like, oh, I wish I could get them because they just worked. Saying that, I've got literally sat on the shelf behind me the brand new Fujifilm speed light and trigger system that I need to get to grips with because they've sent it to me. So I need to learn how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar for me. I mean, my space is so small. I'm just an arm's length away from, you know, changing the setting on a strobe. Really, so the other thing I find very useful, and I use this as a device, really, is that, you know, when I need a breather or when I need a second to think, for example, I use it as a very useful device to just give me that little bit of time, you know, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, just, you know, where you just change something on the back of a strobe, for example, and it just gives you that little breather where you just go, okay, where are we going next? What are we doing next? You know,
and I'm the same with the light meter and the grey card. The grey card is because I want consistency across the gallery. If I'm shooting those 5 different setups, I want the skin tone to be the same across all of them, those kind of things. But the light meter sometimes as well, it can be a little bit of theatre. When you've got clients who are investing and they're like, oh, what are you doing now? Oh, well, I'm just making sure this light is measured exactly right and I'm making sure this colour is exactly right. It adds value. It shows that I know what I'm talking about, and it's a little bit of creative theatre in front of the client. But like you say, it also gives you that thinking time.
Light meter in particular, I had an interesting conversation a while ago with Mark Wallace about this. When you meter, do you meter towards the light or towards the camera?
Towards the light. Because we're exposed for the highlights nowadays. In the old days of that film, they used to expose for the shadows. But a good friend of mine, Damien McGillicuddy, says the only time you meet towards the camera is if it's on fire. And that's your light source. Sometimes I'll do an overall meter reading. If I'm using 2 or 3 lights that are impacting on my frontal exposure, then I may do an overall meter reading. But it'll still usually be based towards that key light. And I also meter every light individually with the others turned off.
Do you have a ratio in your head when you set it up?
Yeah. I have go-tos for pretty much everything, understanding how an accent light impacts on a frontal light and how the ratio of that needs to be is a go-to, but also I'll break them, If I'm doing family shoot after family shoot, I'm looking at 2 stops between the main light and the fill light. Every time on my accent light will be 1 1/3 stops under the key light, so it's not impacting on the exposure. But it doesn't mean that I'll have somebody come in as a family and I go, actually, you suit more contrast, and I'll drop that fill light down another stop. So I've got 3 stops difference and things like that. But I have a go-to starter that for general stuff. But if I'm playing, I'll just play and see. I'll look at the image and go, and it's the one time I shoot tethered is if I'm playing. Right. Because I want to see.
Yeah. I could totally get that. The interesting thing is I'm just thinking through my own process, and I always meter the key light. I very rarely meter the accent line. I'll tell you why I don't do that typically in a headshot situation is because the way the accent light reacts very, very much differs from skin tone to skin tone. Mm-hmm. That's what I find. And so what I tend to do really is I take a few shots because I always shoot tethered in that situation. It's for a number of different reasons, but I always dial that in on the screen, basically, visually, and then carry what's a set, basically. Yeah, it might actually be a good idea. I might actually try and meter that the next time. Never thought. Well,
I just do it because it's quicker because I don't want to take extra pictures. I normally tell if you've got Caucasian skin or you have mixed origin Caucasian skin, it tends to react pretty similar so that, there's less sebaceous secretions, whereas certain Afro-Caribbean skin can be quite heavy on sebaceous oil on the skin, so it tends to be more reflective. So I tend to, I'll start at a stop and a third under on my accent light on a normal shoot, and then if I have the subject that I think your skin's a little shinier, or the makeup artist has put too much highlight on or something like that, then I'll dial it back another third of a stop and just check it and go from there. Because the last thing I see all the time is where the accent light overpowers in the image, and it just spoils the whole structure. It should be there. It should be there to give that little kiss of light and create separation, but not to overpower that lovely dynamicism of the light you put on the face.
And unless it is that really mega contrasty, super poppy, what's the word? Like fitness shoot type of things what I'm thinking about, then...
Yeah, with the double accents, you want it, and you tend to go... I always call it the Bear Grylls, because when he brought his books out, it was what we call badger lighting almost, where you've got a stripe of darkness down the front and then the accents are lighter, and it can work for that kind of dramatic effect, and that's where creativity comes into it, But you're not going to sell 1 million pictures of Joe and Joetta blogs from down the street like that, if you know what I mean. So
sure,
you go with your safeties first, and take it from there.
So how do you adapt your lighting for different faces, different shaped faces, for example?
That's a really good point, and it's something I'm quite conscious of doing. And that's another thing that I used to do for a selling point. I always say I'm going to light your face that suits the structure. So, for example, with if I have somebody with a very heavy set neckline, I'm not going to put any contrast reduction under there. I'm not going to pop a reflector underneath. I might shoot butterfly because it gives me a solid shadow under the jawline and delineates. So that can help with a heavy double chin or 3 chins or 6 chins or whatever you want to call it. Whereas if I've got somebody who's very slender in the face, then I'm going to reduce the contrast because it's going to make them look healthier with a little bit more shape. But in the same way, if I've got a male portrait coming in and it's got a very round face, then I'm going to look at just shooting, say a Rembrandt style, but just taking that one step onto the short side, so the opposite side of the nose to the key light. So I'm shooting into the shadow side, which in effect will make the face look thinner. Those are the kind of things that I'm always looking at. And I do tend to stick with a lot of portraiture to that traditional masculine and feminine, whereas a masculine presenting subject will turn the body into the light and a feminine presenting subject will turn the body away from the light. I do tend to do that in general because it's more complementary, though if I'm shooting an athletic female that I want to give more curvature to, then I'm going to turn them into the light. If I've got a heavier set male who's conscious of the weight, I'm going to turn them out of the light and just break those rules. But they're decisions I make. And this is why my lights will always be in the studio. But if I'm doing individual portraits, they're never set up when the client comes in. Not unless I've met them previously and know what I'm going to shoot. Because I want to look at them, what they bring to wear, what background we're going with, and what style of shoot we're doing. If they're wanting something creative, then I'm going to light it to see what we're doing. Whereas I go to a lot of studios, when I used to visit a lot of studios teaching, it'd be, well, this is my lighting setup, it doesn't move. And I'm like, but what if it doesn't suit? Well, if it doesn't suit, I don't know, because they only understand recipes and not ingredients. And that's a big thing I have.
What do you think are the most commonly made mistakes when it comes to lighting by photographers?
Not metering, guessing the exposures, white balance, not, saying, okay, it's on studio setting, it's on flash white balance, so it must be right. If I had £1 for every time I've metered a white balance and found it off, I'd be a very rich person. Going in with too many lights to start with. They've learned a 4-light setup where they're going to put 2 on the background or 2 accents in. They're going to put a key light in. They're going to put a fill light in without understanding why and just creating a flat mush, if you know what I mean. The one thing I really hate is the twin 45-degree lights from the front. It's just, and I blame the studio lighting manufacturers of the 90s and 2000s for that, because on the back of every camera magazine was an advert showing 2 softboxes at 45 degrees like that. And it's just quite possibly the worst lighting technique you can ever use. And, I spent a couple of years doing a lot of workshops with a lot of school photographers trying to move them away from that. And it's amazing the ones that have, how much it's improved the portraiture.
I actually, I completely concur with you on that. I've never seen worse, especially group portraits with 2 umbrellas or something set up in that configuration. Where cross shadows are never a good look on anybody.
No, they say, one's key light, one's a fill light. Well, no, it's not a fill light because it's creating a cross shadow. When light hits an object, it creates a shadow. So if you're hitting it from the opposite side, you can create 2 sets of shadows. It creates optical confusion. You're just going to end up with a lot of mush. Honestly, I'll get off my soapbox on that, but
it's
just going to put a fill light where the camera is, and job done, man.
Yeah, and one of the best educational courses I've ever come across was actually it's quite a few years old now. But Mark Wallace did a thing for Creative Life years ago, which was actually a course on how to use speedlights. and he went through this whole group portrait, you know, kind of thing. It's probably one of the best, short courses on lighting, on using off-camera light. Although it was centered around speed lights specifically, but of course, those concepts are the same no matter what you use.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Yeah, very much.
so how do you like in your work generally? How do you balance background lights with your key lights or the lights on your subject?
It depends on the scene, really, to be honest. I don't do a lot of traditional white background blown out because it's never been my style, if you know what I mean. It was, and I think I did that because when I set up my first studio, a lot of the studios around me, that's what they did. And I thought, well, when it comes down to that, nobody's going to look at the difference in the quality of the imagery. They're just going to, oh, it's all the same. Who's cheapest? That kind of thing. So I went away from that. So, but having worked for a background company for 2 years, you learn to balance that background into the shot depending on how much I want it to appear. So quite often, there is that little bit of incident light falling on that background, whether that's coming from the key light, which with the one light subject, I'll quite often meet at the two corners of the background and just slightly compromise my key light position to make sure that's even. Just again, save post-production time. It's that, or I will dedicate some light that's going to go on that. Quite family shoots, I tend to use a 2-light setup where I will use my 45-degree key light, your classic Rembrandt light, and then I use a fill light behind the camera, another big light. Well, the effect of the fill light only being 2 stops less than the key light means that I'm getting some light on the background anyway. So it does that. And if I then need more, because it's a very light background that needs to look light in the image, then I light it independently. But for a lot of the time, it's because I never have enough space. Even though my own studio was 800 square feet, Emma's studio I work from now is about 700 square feet. Click was 750 square feet. I never have my subjects more than 3 or 4 foot off the background anyway, unless I'm deliberately going for a dark headshot or something like that. So there's always some light falling on it. It's just how much, and that's where sometimes a black reflector, a subtractor, will come in. So I'll allow that light to hit the background, but I'll use the black reflector to subtract the light bouncing back onto my subject so that I still get the shadow depth that I want, those kind of things. So,
when I first started out, I thought that lighting the background was really was super important, and of course I went through the whole thing, the Peter Hurley school of creating perfectly white backgrounds. The thing, I think, there was a point where I sort of worked out how to do that. In a number of different ways, because the practicalities of it is sometimes you don't have the space to use, 2 strobes on your background. Sometimes you have to just deal with one, depending on what kind of situation you're in. But, once I figured it out, I sort of, to me, I got to the point where I thought, like, it looks too stuck on. And one of the issues that I had was that working with web designers very often, where you're creating images for a white website, you now have an image with a perfectly white background. All of a sudden now these portraits really look stuck on because you can't really see, there's no delineation between the website background and the background in the photo, and then it becomes kind of problematic for me anyway. So I really moved away from that. And what I tend to do now more often than not, and one of the things I really enjoy doing is putting the subject right up close against the backdrop, and then let the key light do what it does and create some shadow on the backdrop, which somehow right now at this moment in time, what is it now? Is it November already? October 2025, something like that.
November this week, isn't it?
Yeah. So for some reason right now, in my head, that's the sort of, that's the thing that I like at the moment. this might be completely different next year, by the way. But for some reason, I sort of enjoy shooting that at the moment. You know.
Yeah, I like shadows. When people are like, oh, you've got a shadow on the background, I'm like, do you know what? People make shadows.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm just like, you walk in a room and you've got a directional light in the room, you're going to put a shadow on the wall. And it's like, guess what? That's real.
And
When there isn't
listen,
shadows,
yeah.
I start to question the validity and the reality of the shot.
Yeah, and it's a stylistic choice. And I think and I'm not knocking it, by the way, but I also do think that people in the beginning, when they first learn, when they learn lighting setups and whatnot, and how to light, it's important to go through the classic 80s. Let's try let's make a gelled vignette on the backdrop, shall we?
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of important to know how to do that.
Yeah, I think it is because, particularly if you're working professionally, you never know when you get asked for that.
Exactly.
Truthfully, and you know what? I remember talking to Tony Hewitt, who was chair of judges at a competition, and he said, right, I want you to introduce yourself. And I said, I'm a photographic prostitute. And he went, I beg your pardon. I went, well, if you're going to pay me money, I'll photograph it. I don't, I have my own opinions on things, but if you tell me you want it done that way and you're prepared to pay for it, then particularly if I don't have to put my name to it, then I'll shoot whatever you want. It's a business,
Yeah.
But I think people go through phases. And I think you're right, actually, Kirsten, that they need to go through phases. There's a big thing at the moment in the wedding thing about smoke bombs and gelled lighting and all of that. And it seems to be that people gravitate, particularly towards education that provides that. But what they're not doing is learning the basics of making sure the groom's tie is straight, that the bride's got her flowers in a nice place with a bent arm and things like that. They're like, oh no, this is super cool because we've got gels. And it's like, okay, go and do that. Then come back and then learn the basics kind of thing. And whereas I like to think I came through the basics first and mastered the basics and tried the creativity along the way. And now I look back at some of the creative, I look back at my purple port from 12 years ago. It's got model images and I go, why did I do that? And I think you go through that. I think particularly when you're coming up through the knowledge levels in photography, you try everything, don't you? And you think something's really cool and really great and all of that. And then you reach a point where you want more perfection. And I found when I got to that point, I lost my creativity a little bit because you're chasing the marginal gains on the simple stuff. And now I've got to the stage where I think I've gone as good as I can ever get. I'm back to playing again a little bit and trying stuff, but with a more educated mindset on it.
So incidentally, that's important. I think that's always important. It's always important to keep that, that little creative space. I had a really great conversation with Joel Grams some time ago, and he told me that he's been in the business for 40 years or whatever, but he does the test shoot every week. Just to try out different things, play around a little bit. A lot of it never sees the light of day, but some of it does, and that's a great way of learning. I'd say what's also a great way of learning is my uncle's wall out in his hallway is hilarious. My uncle's I'll give you a little pretext. My uncle's it's a great family man. He loves going to the local photographer and having family portraits taken, and he's got a number of kids, and so his hallway is basically adorned with lots of portrait images over the years, when the kids are very little to they're now in their 40s.
Okay.
So, and it's a really interesting study on fashion almost, through the decades, to look at those portraits, because when we go back to like the late 80s, you look at that through the lens of 2025, of course. You look at it and you go, whoa, oh wow, okay. It's, that's hardcore. Everything from the lighting to the posing to the just overall rendering of the image, it's such interesting changes that portraiture has gone through, just over the last, or family portraiture actually more specifically, over the last 40 years or something. It's quite interesting to see when you see it all lined up on one wall.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's funny, because you say that, but the fundamentals are still eggs, exactly the same as they were. And I learned this as a cocky photographer when I was starting out. I, my own nature means I've got to research the inside of a backside about everything when I'm interested in something. So photography was the thing. Some portraiture was my thing. So I was like, right, who's the best portrait photographer in the world and all of this? And who was the best 10 years ago and all of that? And I came across the name Montezuma. And everyone was like, no, he was the man on family and individual portraits. He was the best and all of that. So I thought, right. And I looked online. Unfortunately, he'd passed at that point. And there was a little bits online of him teaching. And so I went on eBay and found his portrait books. And I ordered these books and they came and I flicked through them as you do. And this would be 2012, something like that. Yeah, 2011, 2012. I flicked through them and I went, no, this is terrible, awful, shocking stuff. Put it away in the cupboard. I'm like, oh, look at that. Day-glow hair and 80s, because they were all shot in the 80s, that kind of style. And then I remember getting a bit more knowledge and a little bit more and actually watching Hanson Fong posing videos on YouTube. And then I got to meet Hanson last year at WPPI and it was like, whoa, this was a guy that taught me everything I knew about posing when I started. And even though he never knew he taught me that because it was all via YouTube. And then I remember in about 2014, 2015, when I started thinking about getting better at this photography art, pulling out Montezuma's books again. And I went, right, okay, take away the styling, take away the hairstyles. Let's actually look at the posing and the control of light. And there was a little bit more day glow than we'd use nowadays in soft filter. But actually the fundamental posing and structure of posing and the way groups were put together was just beautiful. And it's just the same today. You can't put a square peg in a round hole. And it's just posing is posing because it's what it works. And I always learn from nowadays, I get inspired going to a 1690 stately home that's got paintings on the wall from classical painters. I don't care about the house. I don't care. I look at the posing on the painting. I look at the hand positions and the way the head tilts are and all of that. And it's just as applicable in 2025 coming into 26. And I think you don't know what you don't know until you realize you don't know, is what I'm trying to say.
This is actually interesting. Let's talk about posing a little bit. I often find especially when I teach lighting workshops in particular, when it comes to the shooting part and you get some of the participants to start shooting, they're often, and for some reason, and again, I'm not being sexist or anything, but for some reason, this is particularly true for guys. Mm-hmm. And they're very often much more interested in the technical intricacies of lighting and using gear rather than the actual intricacies of the pose as such.
Yeah, they want to take pictures. I think, and I'm going to say broadly speaking here, that the masculine presenting ones amongst us tend to fixate on technicals rather than let that creativity and that knowledge of posing, for example, come through because that's what they learn the easiest. Whereas in general, and I'm saying in general, a lot of the feminine presenting people that I've taught, they're not interested in f-stops. They're not interested in numbers. They want to learn ratios, and they'll be more interested in saying what numbers they light on. They're learning that it's f4 at first and things like that. But they want the person to look good. Whereas the guys tend to want the light to be all technical and please give me 5 lights when you can do it with 1. Whereas, and like you say, they're not as interested in learning the posing at first. And all of that, they'd rather work with an experienced model that'll do all that, and then they can just fiddle with lights. Whereas the more feminine photographers, and we are, certainly in the UK, we're 60-40 now in the social market, that female photographers leading as such. There's more, but they tend to be more interested in making the subject look good than what the men in general are. And I think I was always lucky with that because I worked straight away with a lot of females that actually I learned quickly that if I didn't make them look good, it didn't matter. I couldn't go, wow, look at my lighting. This is amazing, isn't it? And she'd go, yeah, but, pose gives me an extra bulge of fat there. I wasn't selling pictures. And
Interestingly enough, I mean, this is exactly the thing. Like when you actually listen to the client's feedback, is they'll always comment on posing. Oh, my chins are too prominent, or my nose, or I don't like this side of my face, whatever. It's the comments are 99 times out of 100 have to do with posing, not with, oh, I don't like the way my face is lit, or the shadow. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever said to me, oh, the shadows are really too deep on this side of my face. Never. It's usually, oh, I don't like my knees. I had that comment.
So, yeah. But I do. And that's the thing. And when you work with clients, you learn very quickly that they will focus on the one negative, not the 99 positives.
I tell you what, I did a shoot with hairdressers the other day. That was one of the trickiest shoots I've ever done because I've never come across, they're very lovely, actually, in the end, but I've never come across a group of people who are so incredibly self-conscious. But of course, it goes with the territory. They're hairdressers. That's the thing,
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. The people that are involved in the industries that are aesthetic are even more critical of themselves. And unfortunately, the world's gone that way, and I don't like it. The amount of times I've photographed a really beautiful subject and they think so low of themselves that, they don't see their own beauty. And it's a shame because, that's got a lot to do with social media and everything else. And that's a whole different discussion down a different wormhole.
Yeah.
But
now, I think for me, posing often, or usually always, starts with making a client feel comfortable when they come into the room. What's your sort of go-to procedure for a new client?
When I ran my own studio up north, it was very much they come in, we get a drink, we sit down and we chat. I know that with the average shoot, I need 20 minutes of camera time. That's all I need to get the images that I want, 25 at a push. So I'd rather spend time getting to know that person, breaking the ice, those kind of things, so that when I pick the camera up, we've already started with the rapport stage, and it's much easier than going in cold. When you have somebody walked in, whenever I ran boudoir, when I had boudoir in my own studio, I had a separate makeup room at first, and I moved it. They had a changing room, but I moved the makeup to being done in the main studio. And the reason being, because while that person was having, and this was because I was only doing 2 shoots a day, I could do that. When I was doing 8 shoots a day, you can't do that. But it meant that actually I could spend that time while they were having their hair and makeup done, just to chit chat, that it wasn't a stranger they were walking into and being photographed by. It was somebody they'd spent an hour chit chatting with. And, there was always some drama going on in everybody's lives. The makeup artist, again, and this was a personal thing, I found out fairly quickly that a lot of the boudoir clients who were shooting were mid-40s to 50-year-old women that were a little bit intimidated by a 21-year-old stunningly beautiful makeup artist doing the makeup. They weren't keen at that. And so I actually got involved with a makeup artist who was in her 50s, fantastic hair and makeup artist was Karen, probably the best I've ever used. But she was a woman that could talk about kids, that could talk about problems that teenagers were causing at home, talk about pre-menopause and everything else, and all the things that made these women understand that they were just the same as everybody else. And it was a big change to the environment. That
it's huge. That's actually that's a really great understanding of how human nature in general works, because I think people feel most comfortable amongst people who are very similar to themselves. Ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. A good friend of mine who no longer runs a portrait studio in Leeds, he didn't want high-end clients because he was a working class, grown up on a council estate kind of fellow who would rather shoot 8 families that would spend a couple of £100 than one client that would be high maintenance and didn't have a conversation level that was appropriate for, and things like that. So, it's always easier shooting with people that you can relate to.
So when you get into the posing with a client, do you run through sort of a predetermined sequence of poses, or do you?
Depends on the
Organic.
depends on the shoot. I tend to be a bit more organic, because there's no such thing. Well, there is actually, but there's very few poses that work for everybody. I have a couple of go-tos for boudoir that work for absolutely anybody. But that comes down again to understanding clients and what bits they generally want to hide and what bits they don't want to hide. But basic posing with families or individuals is to always go with the basics, start with the masculine or feminine presenting. I always say this, even if I'm doing a headshot, I pose the feet, because you can't build a house without foundations. And I think I always work upwards up the body. I start with the feet, get the legs in the right position, then get the hip line, then get the shoulder line, then I work the head, then I put the arms, then I put the hands, and it's always that same way every single time. And I'm really prescribed on it as well. Anybody who ever shoots with me, it's always bring your chin back round, bring it back round. Because I've turned the body, the natural reaction is for the head to go with which way the front of the body's facing, so they'll turn out the light. And I'm like, no, you've got to come back into the light. And I'm really quite pernickety, but I'm also very much a demonstrator. The amount of times that you can have somebody who's nervous break into giggles because you're doing a boudoir pose as an 18 stone man who's 6 foot tall with a shaved head and a beard. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
I always think the quickest way for somebody to do something is to mirror, to copy. So you've got to be able to do it yourself, and and it breaks boundaries as well. Doing it that way. But I always go with the masculine or the feminine. Start with the feet, work it upwards from there, and it just falls into place. And I'm not looking for it to look right. I'm looking for it to not look right, not look wrong. If that makes sense.
So what is your approach in when it comes to posing men versus women?
Men are naturally terrible at posing. We just don't do it. And when we try to do it, it looks wrong. So again, it's just like, no, that was wrong. So again, I think it's always easy to show first. So I'll demonstrate. I'll put the feet in the right position. I like most standing mentor poses with a show foot to camera and one at 45 degrees. It's traditionally the weight on the back leg, those kind of things. Open up the chest line to the light, bring the head round to get the lighting pattern that you want, and then sort the hands out from them. I've had many debates with judges and photographers over the year about hands in pockets and all of that. And I'm like, okay, it's 2025, nearly 2026. I don't know any man that will stand outside, put their hands in the pockets and have the thumbs out. It's like, we don't do it. So why do we do it for a photograph? A lot of the old traditional wedding photographers would have the thumbs out. They're like, oh, you've got to, be able to see the hand. I'm like, no, my eyes know that it's gone into a pocket. It's not like an amputation that I can see it's gone into a pocket. Yes, in the ideal world, I want an inch of wrist showing. But if I don't have that, it's not the end of the world, because guess what? Trousers have pockets, jackets have pockets. I know something's gone into a pocket. I'm fussy about arms folded and things like that. But in a sitting pose for a man, I always just put a chair there, put a block up for I'm just thinking back foot for the foot to be raised, and then drop the elbow to the knee of the leading leg. And that's how men sit in a chair. They slouch into it. And I'm like, when you try and do anything else, it looks like one of those school photos where they sat like that. And then just be normal, if you know what I mean. Hands in a suit pose, if you're not going to bring the hands together or fold the arms, put them in a pocket, because otherwise we just don't know what to do with them. Whereas, the feminine subjects tend to have be more aware of what they've seen. So they're more likely to emulate a pose that they've already seen in a magazine or something like that, or they played about with selfies and that kind of stuff. So, yeah. And if I'm posing groups, I always start with one person and add the rest in one by one. Because when you're all you're doing then is you're making one connection and one pose each time and filling in the gaps. If you try and bring everybody together, you're just going to get a mishmash. So I start with a key subject and then I bring in the next person, then the next person, then the next, and build it like that. And very quickly, you can just keep going and going with groups. We've had 22 in the studio and just made it work because you do. It's just what you do. You just follow the rule for each one and it works, and do some research on the basic posing rules. And, if it bends, breaks, it is a classic. Straight arm, straight leg, apart from a sporting leg. I often say to people, look around the room. Can you see any straight joints on any person? If you can't, that's because it's natural. So don't make them sit there with their hands like this and be all straight, all Thunderbirds. But it takes practice. It takes practice. That's what it does. And remember, fat light is flat light.
Again, that is definitely going to go on a t-shirt. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. It's one of my great quotes. Yeah.
How important are micro expressions for you?
More important in headshots than anything else, I think, because the subtlety of connection that can come from a micro expression. And I think the difference is that because I never stop talking while I'm shooting, I never stop talking because I think conversation builds expression. And if you're chatting to people, they never feel awkward because they haven't got time to feel awkward because you're making the brain think. So that way you actually get micro expressions without having to force it as such. But I never ask people to smile. I'll always tell them something stupid or let them tell me something stupid and get a more natural expression that way. But, with boudoir, there's nothing worse. I've heard it from male photographers, and it's always male photographers. Give me a sexy look. I'm like, really? Whereas I'll say something along the lines of, you're in a bar, you've got one chance to get the barman's attention, give him the look that gets his attention. Because most people understand that, and it puts it into a real situation, whereas you're like, oh, give me your best sexy look when your boyfriend comes home. It's like, really? Nobody has a sexy look. It's usually like, what bloody time do you call this? And all of that stuff. But micro expressions can be really important. Connection is very important to me. And it's the one thing I think mirrorless has given us a massive advantage with. I remember being in Selfridges in the Trafford Centre in Manchester, and they had a display on vintage photography. Vintage. By vintage, there was books by Helmut Newton, David Bailey, Comran, and people like that. And I flipped through them all, and I was like, why is the connection so strong here? Why is the connection so strong? And the more I thought about it, it was simply down to waist level finders. So with the waist level finder, you look down, you get your focus, and then you'd lift your head to connect with the subject. And I was like, we spend all this time rapport building, particularly because I was photographing a lot of kids in families at the time. Spend all this time rapport building. I'll sit on the floor and I'll play stupid games with them and do all that. And then what do? We put a big box in front of our face and hide.
It's, that to me was an absolute eye-opener. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of the kind of, the golden age of Hollywood type of portrait. And one of the things I've always loved about like George Orwell's work, for example, was the expressions that he got. Until it's interesting because I had one of George Orwell's former assistants on the show one time, Mark Vieira. It's actually a great episode as well. And so one of the things I've learned was back in the day, so the way he used to do it was because of the way cameras were at the time and whatnot. He would set up the camera and then he would have like a little, like an air, what do you call it? Like a little air puff right up. Release, yeah. And he would basically come in front of the camera and he would literally interact with the subject and then just take the exposure whenever he thought it was ready. But it was just that, it was that immediate interaction with the subject rather than being as you say, hidden behind the camera, or even worse, back in the day of plate cameras, there are black crowd and yeah. So that was a really interesting,
And
thing.
when I switched to mirrorless and was using the camera in front of me instead of at the face, it allowed me to get that connection. And that's what, what's always said about my work is that I usually have very, very good connection with the subject and the camera. And it's because I will talk to them and I will maintain that contact. And it stops it straying as such.
Yeah.
And I learned that from literally looking at old photographs.
Yeah.
Because
it's a really interesting thing.
And it's basic psychology. At the end of the day,
it is.
And then that's where I think photographers go wrong is they concentrate too much on the technicals and don't understand the psychology of people.
Yeah. And it's of course, it's one thing as a photographer, looking through the viewfinder. And this is, I have to say, I mean, personally, I love looking through the viewfinder because it cancels everything out. I'm not really a big screen on the back of the camera kind of shooter because I love just diving into that world, that basically shuts out everything else other than the image that I'm seeing. And I do like that a lot. But of course, when you turn it around and you look at it from the subject's perspective, the person who's taking the picture of you has now disappeared behind that black machine thing and the massive lens, and so of course when you're looking at it from the subject's perspective, you completely understand how that's not the most advantageous position, just generally, completely. Yes, maybe.
And that's why when I used to run my mentoring courses and used to run a year-long course with students, day one, the first thing they had to do was get the other side of the camera.
Yeah.
And feel what it feels like to be photographed. Because it's not nice. I hate it. I always say to people, I've got a face for radio and a voice for a magazine. I'd rather not hear or see my own face on anything. But it's important to understand how it makes people feel, because then you can connect with them more and say, this is why I always advise people that shoot families to have a family portrait of themselves in the studio, because it makes you equate to those people and go, I know I hated it just as much as you do. And my partner hated it even more. But you know what? Well, what we got at the end of it?
Yeah.
That's
a very good exercise. We do this. Actually, we don't do it anymore. But we used to do this annual Christmas family portrait type of thing. We always thought of like some creative angle to it, and we always made it wacky, and it was always fun. Especially when the kids were younger. They were better sports when they were younger. As they turned into older teenagers, I don't know. It just maybe they found it a little silly or whatever. But that was always a thing for us. As a family to do, we would use that as a Christmas card to relatives, across the globe. But it's definitely it's a really interesting experience when you're the subject. When the tables are turned. Now, I mean, we could fill a whole episode just talking about, the connection between, I was going to say suspect and photographer, subjects. But I want to talk a little bit about the business side of running a portrait studio in 2025. What are the sort of the secret ingredients that make a portrait studio successful in 2025?
The number one is a work ethic and concentrating on marketing. At the moment, it's a tough industry out there. It's a tough life for a lot of people. 2025, it's been a hard year for a lot of people. A lot of photographers have gone out of business, unfortunately, because the general public, we are a luxury item for a lot of things. If you're a commercial photographer, it's a little bit different. But if you're a portrait photographer, we are a luxury, The world will carry on without us if we don't take pictures of families and all of that. Yes, they'll miss out on an awful lot, but we aren't an essential. And that's one thing to think about. And you have to market harder. You have to market harder, because without that, you will not get clients through the door, because people still have the money, but they've got to feel that it's important to them, So remembering things like making sure that occasions are celebrated, So do pushes at relevant times of the year, Christmas sessions, all of those things, really important. They don't have to be the Christmas sessions that my partner's just done, Emma, where you're doing, you know, literally back-to-back shoots with Christmas backgrounds. But what they can be is Christmas sessions where you get the family together to create that Christmas card. It doesn't even have to be Christmas themed. You create a portrait for them to go away with and share with their family and things like that. So marketing, you can't just rely on social media. You need multi-marketing streams. And the number one is a good website, because unless you write at the bottom end, people are going to check your website out before they book you. If you're super, super cheap, it'll go on Facebook ads and things like that. But how often do we, for anything, we'll see something on Facebook, but then we go and look at the website and look at the content on the website. So make sure you've got a website that's performing, that looks good, and the imagery on it is good. And then it's just a case of create the experience, not just the image. Because when you create the experience, and this is the same for any kind of person-to-person business that particularly is a luxury type thing, is people will talk about the experience. They won't talk about, they'll forget about the money if the experience is good. And that's the one thing. So make sure your studio's clean, tidy, and presentable. Make sure that your communication is sharp with people, as in gives them all the information that they want. Millennials and the younger generation don't like using the telephone, but I love talking to people. So I would always get that email inquiry and I say, when's a convenient time to call you, and pick up the phone and talk to them. Because then you can become relatable. You can build a rapport. You can ask them, why are you doing this, fam? Oh, it's your mum's birthday. Oh, how old's your mum? Oh, right, I remember my mum was this age. And you build that connection with people, and then you also then starting to sell. So it's keeping that going. Getting clients through the door is the hard bit. But when you bring them through the door, make sure the experience is good, the imagery is sellable. It doesn't have to be perfect, but make sure it's sellable, make sure it's good enough that they value it, and then just concentrate on that experience. That is the biggest thing. Biggest tip I can get to anybody is give a good experience and people will come back and they'll talk about it to the friends.
And you mentioned marketing a second ago, the need to market harder. What, in your experience, is the most effective marketing strategy for you?
For me, it's, and I'm going to talk more about my partner's studio than me now, because I don't run my studio at the moment. I'm doing the odd bits and bobs, but I've kind of pivoted in the industry a little bit more. You've got to advertise. You've got to have an advertising budget. You've got to work on a return on that. I've spoke with many of the high-end studios over the years, and realistically, you've got to be looking at a 10% acquisition cost. So if you're looking for a £300 client, you should be looking at investing £30 in adverts or marketing or work on your website to get that client. If you're looking for a £900 client, then you're looking at a £90 investment. And, you've got to make sure that you put aside money for a marketing strategy. And if you can't do it yourself, then there's lots of people out there that can help you with the marketing strategy, but you've got to target with adverts. You've got to make sure you're ranking high on Google. Make your social media less about your pictures and more about the client and yourself. And massive. I've just literally, my Instagram I've got really lazy with, because I've worked for organisations for the last 2.5 years. So my personal Instagram had gone very stagnant at 12,500 followers. I did some work with the Flash Centre in London and their content team, video excerpts of the whole workshop. They put a video up, tail end of last week, of a small segment of a teaching on butterfly lighting and the understanding behind it. And it's done incredibly well. And I've grown 600 followers in the last 5 days.
Oh, wow.
And that's because it's not because of a picture that's amazing. The picture's at the end of the video, but it's the behind the scenes that people want. People love to see the realism in the studio of it going wrong when that child's screaming and crying, the crying shots and all of those things. People love that because it humanizes the experience, and make your social media not just selling, but make it look like you are an interesting person. Give them things on your website, blogs that they can relate to. If you're a child photographer and a baby photographer, then, write blog posts about coming out of hospital and the chaos that it causes, when you've got a new baby at home, and little things like, don't worry if you're going to be 15 minutes late to your session. We get that. Those kind of things, humanize things, make yourself personable, and add that to some strategic adverts on offers and things like that. And people will come, because people like people. And if they like you, they'll invest in you. If they don't like you, or they don't see that human element because all you're showing is pictures, then it makes them very hard to invest in you.
Yeah. How do you maintain that client relationship? And in order to, let's say, in order to encourage a repeat business, for example.
Again, that comes down to a great experience, and the one thing that nothing goads me more in the photography industry than hidden pricing. Make your prices transparent, right? Particularly if you're in the UK, right? We are British, we are UK citizens. We grow up in a culture of being afraid to be embarrassed. Yeah. So if your pricing structure is not visible and people don't know if they're going to be embarrassed to whether they can afford something, they won't come. It's the same as walking into a clothes shop and seeing a beautiful shirt, but you don't know how much it costs. So you're not going to ask, you're going to walk out because you assume you can't afford it. Whereby if you're transparent with your pricing and people can say, okay, I can or I can't afford it, and it's okay for people not to be able to afford you. And it's okay that if your business model is that you are more affordable, but you want to shoot more volume, that is also okay. I learned that very quickly. There's photographers that will want to get £2,500, £3,000 per shoot. And that's okay. But they're going to look for less clients than the photographer who's happy to do 10 shoots at £300. Neither is wrong. It's a choice. You know what I mean? But I remember, and it was actually Charlie about 10 years ago before I even really knew him, doing a marketing talk, saying if you've got that one client that's going to give you a 5-10 grand investment, that's brilliant because it's one shoot and they're going to buy loads and it's going to be great. But what if they don't turn up? You've lost everything. Yeah. If you've got 10 clients that are going to give you £500 a piece and one of them doesn't show up, you've still got 4,500.
He said exactly the same to me. He said, like, if you do 2 shoots a week and one of them has the flu, you're 50% down immediately. Yeah. Here. But if you have 10 clients a week and one of them has the flu, it's not that big of a problem.
No, and again, it's if you're fitting it around busy parts of your life, 2 shoots a week might be sufficient for you, and you'd rather search for that higher end client that will do it, because there is that client out there. There's people that are shooting them, but find the model that suits you and suits your studio or suits your location shooting, whatever, and then think like them and try and attract with them. Try and work with other businesses that are also involved in that level of client. That's by far the easiest, My partner, Emma, she has a yoga studio stroke fitness massage place that's also in the same building, and they do pregnancy massage courses and stuff like that, and just popping in there, she takes pictures for the owner, but it gives access to clients as well, and it's, if Tanya, who runs that, will always recommend her for anybody who's looking for a newborn photographer or a family photographer. If you can make connections, it makes life easier.
Yeah. Network. That's the thing.
Network's so important, and networking with other photographers as well. See them as, collaboration, not competition.
I tell you, this is actually one thing. This is very close to my heart because I'm a big believer in networking. And it's often said, photography is a very solitary profession. So, networking with other photographers is worth it just, from that perspective. But I can't even tell you how much I've learned from exchanging views and whatever else with other photographers. I mean, this podcast is actually a really good example because I always call it my own personal university. I've had I've been incredibly lucky having had the opportunity to having had these conversations with so many different people, and also hearing different opinions, from different schools of thought, for example. And I find that very helpful because it helps me make up my mind and try things and change things and refine things or whatever. And also realizing that, okay, well, what works in California might not necessarily work here on the outskirts of London, for example, for a variety of reasons. But it's just, it's a learning experience. I've found this extremely helpful. We talked about Charlie Kaufman, for example, a little while ago. I've had him on the show. I've managed to get to know him a little bit over the last year, and it is unbelievable having conversation with somebody who's had that wealth of experience, not only in photography but also in marketing, for example. Um, it's been, that to me has been the single most useful factor certainly in my photographic career or history or whatever you want to call it. Of the last 15 years or something, for sure. It's finding other photographers and
it's those conversations at the bar and in the food halls at places that you sit down with people you don't know and you chat and you find out things, and they can be just as good as any class you go to, because having somebody who, the other week I was looking on a Facebook group and somebody was very ill on the morning of a wedding they were going to shoot. So they got a second shooter. They'd found somebody to cover the wedding, but that person had crashed on the way to the wedding. And so she put it in a local photographers group. Is anybody that can just cover till she gets there? And people turn out and help. Now, if you don't make those connections because you stay sterile in your own environment and always see people as competition, those people won't be there to help you.
Exactly. And it's exactly the same in the podcasting world. It's the amount of times that I've been able to send a text message to somebody who said, like, hey, I've got this problem. Of the amount of times that I've asked David Berkman for advice. I mean, clearly, whenever you need to know anything, all you have to do is ask David Berkman. We all know that. But the amount of times that I've just sent him a text message like, hey, I've got this, I've got this issue. What do you think? And he'll immediately respond and goes like, I think you should do this. Oh, cool. The list of names is endless, and I've always found it a super useful thing. Steve Brazel from the Behind the Shot podcast, for example, anything to do with podcasting, I'm immediately, I shoot him a message. I say like, hey, Steve, what about this and what about that? And we exchange a lot of ideas, back and forth all of the time. I can't emphasize enough how useful that is, which is why I love going to expos, like whether it's imaging, whether it's the photography show over here in the UK, or even smaller expos. It's so useful to meet people and
huge. I've made all my friends in the industry through networking.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's great because you get things like invited to do podcasts, you get invited to collaborate on things, you get invited to do, I'm trialing this software. Do you want to trial it at the same time and give me your thoughts? And it opens doors. But if you just sit there on your own thinking the whole world's against you and it's just competition, you're never going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never going to do.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. But before we finish up, we're going to finish up with a rapid fire round. Okay. So, got 5 questions. Rapid fire. Quick question, quick answer. Here you go. One lighting modifier you couldn't live without.
135 volt bulbs.
Cool. Hard light or soft light?
Soft.
Every time. Studio or natural light?
I like both, but studio gives me control, and I'm a control freak.
Cool. Most underrated posing tip?
If it bends, break it.
Cool.
Never have a stiff joint.
Right. Well, that's what she said. One piece of business advice you wish you'd learned earlier.
Learn the business first. Photography you can get better at in time, but learn business first.
Fantastic. Gary, thank you so much.
No, thank you. And a pleasure. It's gone very dark here now, but so thankfully I've still got enough light off my screen, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. And anybody that wants to get involved, join the Guild of Photographers. Come and drop me a message and I'll sort you out a discount code.
And of course, all the links will be in the description below, no matter whether you're listening in audio or on YouTube.
Brilliant. Kirsten, thank you.
Okay, folks, that is it for today. What an absolute pleasure having Gary Hill on the show. His insights into crafting light, directing confident poses, and running a successful portrait studio were truly invaluable. And as always, before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you'll love. Check out episode 258, How to Win Photo Competitions with none other than Bure Perry himself. It's a fascinating behind-the-scenes look at what judges really look for and how to take your portrait work to the next level. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It really does mean the world to us. I don't know why I keep saying us, it's really just me. And helps us keep creating more exciting episodes. Who writes this stuff for now? And make sure you don't forget to head over to www.camerashakepodcast.com. Sign up to the mailing list. We've got some incredible stuff coming up very soon, actually very soon, so you'll know about it first. For those of you listening to the audio version, did you know that there's a fully fledged video version over on YouTube with plenty of examples of our guests' photography in full Technicolor? Well, you should by now because I mention it all the time. Just search for Camerashake Podcast on YouTube and you can watch all past episodes there. And if you're already on YouTube, well, make sure to drop us a comment, hit the like button, and ring the bell. Share with your friends. Your engagement helps us reach a wider audience all over the world. And as always, keep shaking things up in the world of photography, and I'll see you next Thursday.